It is just past 9:30 at night on the 2nd of August, 2026, in a town of roughly 35,000 people called Lyudinovo in Russia's Kaluga region, when the sky over a Rosneft fuel terminal lights up orange. Within minutes, Telegram channels tied to the region are posting the same thing. Fire, again at the Kaluga Nefta product oil depot. This is not the first time, it is not even the fifth time. And that repetition is exactly why this particular patch of tank farms, sitting quietly about 170 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, has become one of the more revealing case studies in how Ukraine is trying to choke off the fuel that keeps Russian units running, one storage tank at a time. Let's be precise about what actually happened, because precision is the only thing that separates a real strike from telegram noise. According to Ukraine's general staff, in a statement carried by Ukrinform and confirmed independently by Ukrainska Pravda and Euromaidan Press, the Ukrainian armed forces struck 4 targets on the night of August 1st into August 2nd: the Saratov oil refinery, the Engels strategic airfield, a drone storage and launch site near Navlya in the Bryansk region, and the fuel depot in Lyudinovo, Kaluga Oblast. The General Staff's own language, quoted directly by Ukrinform, described the strikes as part of an effort to reduce the military and economic capabilities of the Russian aggressor. That is not colorful language from a headline writer. That is the stated military objective in the General Staff's own words. So what exactly is this depot? And why does a single fuel terminal in a mid-sized Russian town keep showing up in wartime news cycles going back to 2024? The Lyudinovskaya oil depot is part of Kaluga Neft Product, which is itself a regional subsidiary of Rosneft, Russia's largest and most politically connected oil company. According to reporting from Militarnyi, a Ukrainian defense outlet that reviewed open-source satellite imagery, the tank farm holds 9 storage tanks with a combined capacity of about 6,700 cubic meters, storing AI-92 and AI-95 grade gasoline along with diesel fuel. That is not a boutique gas station. That is a regional logistics node, the kind of facility that exists specifically to keep vehicles, generators, and support units supplied over long distances. Here is the part that matters most for understanding why Ukraine keeps coming back to this exact spot. When Ukraine's Special Operations Forces struck the same depot in January of 2025, the General Staff statement, reported by Ukrinform and separately by Ukrainska Pravda, was unusually specific about the target's function. The depot, they said, is part of JSC Kaluga Neft Product and is a logistics center that supplies units of the Russian armed forces that are directly involved in the war against Ukraine. That is a direct, on-the-record claim from the Ukrainian military about military end use, not speculation from an analyst. And that same description was repeated again in August 2026, when the General Staff said the depot is used for the storage and supply of fuel and lubricants, in particular to meet the needs of the Russian armed forces, according to Ukrinform's translation of the original statement. Now, before we go further, an honest caveat. Because a channel built on trust has to hold itself to that standard even when the story is exciting. The title, framing you may have seen elsewhere that this is the one fuel depot keeping an entire regional defense network alive, is a dramatic simplification. It is not literally the only fuel source available to Russian forces in the area, and treating any single depot as a war-deciding choke point would be an overstatement Ukraine's own military has never actually made. What is true and verifiable is that this specific facility has been targeted repeatedly, precisely because it is one of a shrinking number of regional nodes still capable of moving meaningful volumes of fuel toward units operating near the front. Ukraine is not betting on one knockout blow. It is running a campaign of attrition against dozens of these nodes simultaneously, and Lyudinovo happens to be one of the most frequently revisited addresses on that list. To understand why Kaluga region specifically keeps drawing Ukrainian drones, it helps to zoom out from the fuel tanks for a moment and look at what else sits in that same regional footprint. About 60 kilometers away, in the city of Kaluga itself, there's a facility called the Kaluga Instrument Making Plant, commonly referred to by its product line name, Typhoon, or Tayfun in Russian. This is not a fuel depot. It is something arguably more sensitive, a defense industrial plant. According to Open Sanctions, which tracks entities under Western sanctions regimes, Typhoon JSC is described as a leading enterprise in Russia's military-industrial complex that develops, manufactures, and supplies weapon systems that are actively used by the Russian armed forces in the war of aggression against Ukraine. The same source notes that Typhoon developed the BALE coastal missile system, which Russian forces used to fire cruise missiles into Ukraine's Odessa region back in June 2022, and the Rubezh ME coastal missile system, which has reportedly been used to launch strikes from occupied Crimea. Defense Express, a Ukrainian defense-focused outlet, adds more texture here, describing Typhoon as a facility with more than 2,000 personnel, one that is sometimes mistaken for a modest radio electronics workshop, but is in fact, in their words, a powerful military industry enterprise. Its specialty, according to Defense Express, is systems for coastal defense missile complexes, along with radar equipment like the Monolith B Mobile Radio Reconnaissance Complex and the Positive M shipborne radar system. Andriy Kovalenko, who heads Ukraine's Center for Countering Disinformation, confirmed on Telegram after a November 2024 strike that Typhoon also produces components tied to air defense systems, aviation equipment, and missile complexes, and that the plant performs maintenance and modernization work on equipment already in service with Russian forces. So when you put those two facilities on the same map, a fuel logistics hub in Lyudinovo and a sanctioned missile and radar component plant in Kaluga city itself, you start to see why this region, unglamorous as it might sound compared to frontline combat zones, keeps appearing on Ukraine's target lists. It is not one building. It is a cluster of infrastructure that, taken together, supports both the physical movement of Russian forces and the production of the weapon systems those forces rely on. That November 2024 night is actually a useful case study in how these strikes tend to unfold because both facilities were hit within hours of each other. According to Euromaidan Press and corroborating reports from RBC Ukraine and the Kyiv Post, drones struck both the Kaluga Neft product oil depot and the Typhoon plant on the night of November 25, 2024. Kaluga's regional governor, Vladislav Shapsha, posted on Telegram that air defense systems intercepted 8 drones over the region, and that debris from the downed drones caused a fire at an unnamed industrial site. Notice the framing difference there. Ukrainian sources described a direct strike on a named sanctioned military facility. The regional governor described falling debris causing an unspecified fire. Both things get reported, and a serious analysis has to sit with that gap rather than pretend it doesn't exist. The Kyiv Independent explicitly noted in its own coverage of a separate Kaluga strike that it cannot verify claims made by Russian officials. And that caution applies just as much in the other direction, since Ukraine's own claims of precision strikes are not independently verified by neutral outlets in real time either. What we can verify, though, is the pattern of recurrence, and that pattern is not subtle. Let's walk through the documented timeline, because the frequency itself is the story. In April of 2024, according to Militarnyi's review of open-source footage, 2 aircraft-type drones struck the Lyudinovo tank farm, and the impact caused a gasoline tanker holding close to 700 cubic meters of fuel to explode. That was the first confirmed hit on this specific location. 7 months later, on November 25, 2024, the depot was struck again, this time in tandem with the Typhoon plant strike we just discussed. Then, on the night of January 17th into January 18th, 2025, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces hit the depot once more, an attack confirmed independently by Reuters and the Associated Press, both of which cited Governor Shapsha's own telegram statements describing 7 drones shot down and 1 landing in what he called a non-residential area, with no casualties reported. Reuters specifically noted that Russia's defense ministry and the governor of neighboring Bryansk region separately claimed air defenses destroyed a total of 9 drones over the broader area that same night, giving us 2 independently sourced, though not perfectly matching, accounts of the same event. Then the calendar rolls forward almost a full year to January 1st, 2026, when Ukrainian drones struck the depot yet again. According to reporting picked up by the outlet NV and referenced in coverage from Charter 97, satellite imagery reviewed after the strike showed a large-scale fire with smoke visible stretching for several kilometers, consistent with burning petroleum products rather than a minor debris fire. Analysts reviewing those images noted that at least 2 of the facility's 9 tanks had already been destroyed in earlier 2024 strikes, and the scale of the new blaze suggested additional tank losses, though the exact numbers struck on that specific night could not be confirmed from satellite imagery alone. And then, just 2 nights before this video was researched, on August 1st into August 2026, the cycle repeated itself once more, this time as part of a coordinated 4-target operation that also hit the Saratov refinery, a facility Ukraine's general staff described, in a statement reported by Ukrainska Pravda, as capable of processing around 7 million tons of oil per year, and the Engels airfield, home to Russia's Tu-95MS and Tu-160 strategic bombers, the same long-range aircraft that have been used to launch missile strikes against Ukrainian cities. 5 confirmed strikes on 1 fuel depot across roughly 27 months. That is not a coincidence, and it is not random targeting. It is a deliberate, repeated campaign against a facility that keeps getting rebuilt, restocked, and hit again. Why does Ukraine keep spending drones, resources, and operational risk on a facility that clearly gets patched up and returns to service? To answer that honestly, we have to zoom out even further, beyond Kaluga entirely, and look at what Ukraine's military has said about its broader long-range strike doctrine. This is where the fresher data becomes genuinely important, because it tells us this is not an isolated obsession with one town. According to Reuters, citing trade data reported on January 17, 2026, Russia's seaborne exports of petroleum products declined by 1% in 2024, falling to 113, 7 million metric tons, a drop that Reuters directly connected to the uptick in Ukrainian drone attacks on refining and export infrastructure. That is a macro-level, verifiable economic effect, not a propaganda claim. It comes from trade flow data, not from either side's press office. The Kyiv Independent's own reporting adds further texture to that picture, noting that Ukraine has targeted refineries in Tuapse on Russia's Black Sea coast, in Ilyich, and in Novoshakhtinsk, with strikes that have led to what the outlet describes as reductions or outright suspensions in operations at those sites. On January 14, 2026, according to Ukraine's general staff as relayed by the Kyiv Independent, Ukrainian forces carried out what they themselves called their most massive strike on Russian military and industrial facilities to date, reaching targets as far as 1,100 kilometers, or about 620 miles, inside Russian territory. That strike reportedly hit chemical plants, additional refineries, and ammunition depots specifically at the Engels Air Base, the same strategic bomber base that would be hit again less than 3 weeks later. This is the strategic logic Ukraine's defense forces have articulated repeatedly, and it is worth quoting rather than paraphrasing loosely, because the wording itself is the evidence. In a statement following a separate but related strike campaign against oil infrastructure across multiple Russian regions in July 2026, the head of Ukraine's security service, known by the acronym SBU, Yevhen Kamara, said, according to the Kyiv Post, on the president's instructions, we are doing everything possible to ensure Russia pays a daily price for its crimes. He continued, as long as the enemy continues attacking peaceful Ukrainian cities, its military and fuel infrastructure will continue to suffer significant losses. That is about as close to an explicit doctrine statement as you will find from a wartime intelligence service, tying the fuel infrastructure campaign directly to a policy of reciprocal, sustained economic pressure rather than a single decisive blow. President Volodymyr Zelensky has echoed a similar framing publicly. Following the August 2nd, 2026 strikes on Saratov, Engels, and Lyudinovo, Zelensky thanked Ukraine's defense forces, according to a statement reported by National Security Journal, for expanding Ukraine's long-range strike capabilities, and for what he called delivering precise results. He added in the same statement, "We continue applying our long-range sanctions against Russian facilities that serve the war effort and finance the aggression." Notice that word choice, sanctions. Zelensky is deliberately framing physical drone strikes using the language of economic policy, positioning these attacks as an extension of the broader Western sanctions regime, rather than as conventional battlefield strikes. Whether you find that framing persuasive or not, it tells you how Ukraine's own leadership wants this campaign understood publicly. Let's bring this back down to ground level in Kaluga, though, because macro strategy only means something if we understand what it looks like on the ground, night after night, in a town most viewers have never heard of before this video. Lyudinovo is not a major city. It sits in a heavily industrial corner of Kaluga Oblast, roughly 170 kilometers from Ukrainian-controlled territory, according to Militarnyi's geolocation of the facility. That distance matters because it places the depot well within range of Ukraine's longer-endurance strike drones, the kind that have increasingly allowed Kyiv to reach targets that would have been considered safely out of range earlier in the war. 170 kilometers is not a trivial engineering challenge for a one-way attack drone, but it is well inside the demonstrated operational envelope Ukraine has shown repeatedly since 2024, and the fact that Lyudinovo has now been hit at least 5 separate times underscores that this is a repeatable, sustainable capability rather than a one-off demonstration strike. There's a smaller but telling detail buried in the interception numbers across these incidents, and it's worth pulling out on its own because it hints at how Russian air defense planners have had to keep adjusting their posture around Kaluga over time. In November 2024, Governor Shapsha claimed 8 drones intercepted over the region, while Russia's Ministry of Defense separately claimed 23 drones destroyed across multiple regions that same night, according to reporting from United 24 Media and the Moscow Times. 2 months later, in January 2025, Shapsha's own figure was 7 drones downed over Kaluga specifically, with Bryansk's governor separately reporting 9 destroyed over the border area, according to Reuters. By November 2024, Kovalenko's own account, relayed through the NSDC's Center for Countering Disinformation, put emphasis less on interception counts and more on confirming that the strikes had reached their intended targets despite whatever air defense was in place. Taken together, these figures don't tell us anything definitive about how effective Russian air defenses around Kaluga actually are in percentage terms, since neither side publishes complete, verifiable totals of drones launched versus drones intercepted for any single night. What they do show, consistently, across incident after incident, is that some number of drones get through every single time, regardless of how many get shot down, and that the facilities that do get hit tend to be hit hard enough to produce large, sustained fires rather than minor, contained incidents. That is arguably more informative than any single interception percentage would be. Air defense in this war has never been about achieving zero penetration. It's been about probability, and over 5 separate nights, spanning more than 2 years, the probability has consistently favored at least some drones reaching the Lyudinovo tank farm. It's also worth noting what local Russian officials have and have not confirmed across these incidents, because the contrast is itself informative. Governor Shapsha's public statements across multiple incidents from November 2024 through January 2025 follow a fairly consistent pattern. Acknowledge a fire, attribute it either to falling drone debris or to an industrial site, without always naming the facility directly, state a number of drones intercepted by air defense, and emphasize that no casualties occurred. That is a communication strategy any regional government might adopt in wartime, minimizing panic while not flatly denying that something happened. What it does not do is confirm, in Russian officials' own words, the military logistics function that Ukraine's general staff has repeatedly attributed to the site. That gap between the two sides' framing is exactly the kind of thing a careful viewer should notice, and exactly the kind of thing this channel will always flag rather than smooth over for the sake of a cleaner narrative. There's also a genuinely unverified thread running through some of the coverage that deserves an honest mention rather than a quiet omission. Multiple Ukrainian outlets, including Militarnyi, reported that alongside the November 2024 strike on the oil depot and the Typhoon plant, there were additional unconfirmed claims circulating about possible damage extending to other nearby industrial sites. Those secondary claims were never independently confirmed by named sources the way the core oil depot and Typhoon plant strikes were, and responsible reporting treats them as exactly that, unconfirmed chatter rather than established fact. We're not going to repeat them here as though they were verified, because they weren't. There's also a repair and rebuild economics angle here that rarely gets discussed, but matters enormously for understanding why a 5-time target like Lyudinovo stays in service at all instead of simply being abandoned. Independent oil and gas analyst Boris Ehrenstein quoted in reporting compiled on Wikipedia's tracker of the 2025 to 2026 Russian fuel crisis, described the cumulative effect of repeated, coordinated drone waves as producing what he called the most severe crisis in recent years, specifically because, in his assessment, the size, coordination, and repetition of the strikes leaves Russian facilities unable to complete repairs before the next wave arrives. That dynamic, a facility perpetually caught between partial repair and renewed damage, appears to describe Lyudinovo almost exactly. A depot hit in April 2024, hit again in November 2024, hit again in January 2025, hit again on New Year's Day 2026, and hit again in early August 2026 is a facility that has spent roughly 2.5 years cycling between damage assessment, partial reconstruction, and renewed fire, never fully returning to undamaged baseline capacity. Separately, S&P Global Commodity Insights, in earlier Factbox reporting on the broader refinery strike campaign, noted that Russian oil analysts were watching closely to see whether refining capacity outages would force Moscow to either cut crude production, playing into voluntary OPEC plus output cuts already agreed at the time, or shift toward exporting more raw crude at the expense of refined diesel and fuel oil flows, since crude that can't be refined domestically still has to go somewhere. That is the kind of downstream, second-order economic consequence that a single depot fire in a town of 35,000 people can feed into, even though no single strike on its own could ever be described as decisive. Let's talk about the tanks themselves for a moment, because the physical mechanics of what happens when a drone hits a fuel storage tank actually explain why this target category keeps producing dramatic footage. A tank farm, holding roughly 6,700 cubic meters of gasoline and diesel, spread across 9 separate storage tanks according to Militarnyi's satellite analysis, is not a single point of failure. It is a distributed target. Hitting 1 or 2 tanks, as appears to have happened in the April 2024 and earlier strikes, damages capacity but does not eliminate the facility. That is precisely why Ukraine has returned to this location repeatedly rather than treating a single strike as mission accomplished. Each successive attack degrades total storage capacity a little further, forces costly repairs and rebuilding, and, critically, forces Russian logistics planners to either accept reduced throughput at this node or divert additional resources toward air defense coverage they might otherwise deploy elsewhere. That is the attritional logic underlying the entire campaign, and it applies just as much to Lyudinovo as it does to the refineries in Saratov, Tuapse, or Novoshakhtinsk. It's worth pausing here to address something that skeptical viewers rightly ask about any wartime infrastructure story. Does hitting fuel depots actually change anything on the battlefield, or is this mostly symbolic? The honest answer, based on what's actually verifiable, is that we don't have battlefield-level data connecting a specific Lyudinovo strike to a specific unit running out of fuel at the front. That kind of granular causal chain almost never gets confirmed publicly by either side, for obvious operational security reasons. What we do have is the macro trade data from Reuters showing a real, measurable 1% decline in Russia's seaborne petroleum exports, and we have Ukraine's own repeated strategic statements, from the SBU chief to President Zelensky himself, explicitly describing this as a deliberate campaign to impose cumulative economic and logistical costs over time, rather than to achieve any single decisive effect. If you're looking for a moment where one drone strike ends the war, that's not what this is, and no credible source has claimed otherwise. If you're looking for evidence of a sustained, verifiable, multi-year campaign that is measurably degrading Russian fuel export and refining capacity, the trade data and the repeated strike pattern on facilities like the one in Lyudinovo are about as close to hard evidence as this kind of asymmetric conflict tends to produce. Let's also be fair to the scale question, because 5 strikes on one depot sounds dramatic in isolation, but it's worth placing it in the context of everything else Ukraine has hit in the same general window. In the same set of reports covering 2026 alone, we see confirmed or reported strikes on the Tenneco and Taif NK refineries in Tatarstan's Nizhnekamsk hit on Russia Day, June 12, 2026, according to Ukraine's General Staff as reported by the Kyiv Post. We see a strike campaign in early July 2026 that hit a refinery in Yaroslavl, Baltic oil export terminals in the Leningrad region, and an industrial facility in Kaluga, again, this time identified by the SBU as the Pervy Zavad refinery. According to Kyiv Post, reporting that specifically noted the outlet had updated its story once the SBU confirmed Ukraine's involvement. We see a mid-July strike deep into Bashkortostan targeting the Gazprom Neftekhim Salavat petrochemical complex, a facility so significant that, according to Kyiv Post's sourcing, it had processed over 7 million metric tons of raw material in 2024 alone, representing close to 3% of Russia's entire refining capacity. Lyudinovo, in other words, is not an outlier obsession. It is one node in a genuinely nationwide campaign spanning thousands of kilometers of Russian territory, from the Baltic coast to Tatarstan to Bashkortostan, all pursuing the same basic logic of sustained pressure on fuel and refining infrastructure. There's one more layer of context that transforms this from an interesting military story into something with visible consequences for millions of ordinary people, and it's the domestic fuel crisis now unfolding inside Russia itself. This is where the freshest reporting gets genuinely striking. According to CNN's analysis published in July 2026, nearly all of Russia's 83 regions are now experiencing gasoline shortages or supply disruptions, with many gas stations imposing rationing. Sumit Ratolia, lead analyst for refining supply and modeling at the commodities intelligence firm Kepler, told CNN that Russian gasoline production is currently running at around 20% below domestic demand because of the Ukrainian strikes, with refinery processing rates at multi-year lows. Ratolia specifically noted that this year's crisis is worse than a similar disruption Russia experienced the previous August, telling CNN, "The key difference is the scale and persistence of the attacks." The numbers behind that assessment are worth sitting with. According to an Associated Press count cited in coverage from the Dallas Express, Ukraine carried out more than 50 reported attacks on Russian energy infrastructure between March and early July of 2026 alone, with several facilities struck multiple times, echoing exactly the kind of repeat targeting we've been tracing at Lyudinovo. Analysts cited in that same reporting estimate that roughly 1/3 of Russia's total oil refining capacity is currently offline. Separately, Wikipedia's continuously updated tracker on the 2025 to 2026 Russian fuel crisis, drawing on BBC Verify and BBC Russian's reporting, states that Ukrainian drone attacks reached a record level in August 2025, when 14 refineries were targeted in a single month, and that 21 of Russia's 38 large refineries had been hit at least once since January 2025 alone. A separate CNN analysis dated June 25, 2026, and cited in that same tracker, puts the cumulative figure even higher, stating Ukraine has struck Russian oil facilities more than 300 times since the start of the full-scale invasion in February 2022. The Kyiv Independent's on-the-ground reporting from late June and early July 2026 captures what that campaign looks like in practice. The outlet documented Russia's Lukoil Nizhegorod Nefteorg Syntez refinery, described as the country's 4th largest and its 2nd largest gasoline producer, being struck on June 24th, forced offline, only partially restarted, and then struck again on July 2nd, shutting it down a second time before it had even fully recovered. The same reporting notes that, as of that writing, only one of Russia's major refineries, Rosneft's Angarsk facility in Irkutsk Oblast had avoided damage entirely in 2026, and largely for a simple geographic reason. It sits roughly 4,450 kilometers, or about 2,700 miles, from Ukrainian-controlled territory, putting it well beyond the range that even Ukraine's longest-endurance drones have demonstrated. Compare that distance to Lyudinovo's mere 170 kilometers, and the exposure gap becomes obvious. Facilities in Kaluga region were never going to be the hard cases for Ukrainian planners. They were always going to be among the easiest, most repeatable targets on the list, which is precisely why a single depot there has now absorbed 5 confirmed strikes, while facilities deep in Siberia remain untouched. None of this is abstract for people actually living through it. Separate wire reporting picked up by AOL News described scalpers in some Russian regions, filling jerry cans and makeshift tankers and reselling fuel at enormous markups, with wholesale A95 petrol prices on the St. Petersburg International Mercantile Exchange hitting record highs roughly 50% above January levels, according to that same reporting. In the Kurylsky district of the Kuril Islands, officials reportedly halted public sales of lower-octane A92 gasoline outright. In Crimea, some retailers reportedly limited sales to coupon or card holders only. None of those specific downstream effects are directly tied to the Lyudinovo depot alone, and it would be dishonest to claim otherwise. But they are the visible, verifiable, real-world texture of the exact strategy that Ukraine's SBU chief and President Zelensky have both described in their own words. A sustained campaign meant to make the war more expensive, more disruptive, and more visible to the Russian public with every week that passes, one depot, one refinery, and one terminal at a time. So, where does that leave Kaluga specifically, and what should a careful viewer actually take away from all of this? First, the verified core. The Lyudinovskaya oil depot in Kaluga Oblast has been struck by Ukrainian forces at least 5 confirmed times since April 2024, most recently on August 2nd, 2026, and Ukraine's general staff has consistently and specifically described it as a logistics facility supplying fuel to Russian armed forces units directly involved in the war. Second, the surrounding context. Kaluga region also hosts the Typhoon instrument-making plant, a sanctioned defense industrial facility producing missile, radar, and air defense components, struck in the same broader campaign in November 2024, which helps explain why this particular region carries strategic weight beyond just fuel logistics. Third, the honest caveats. Russian officials have consistently confirmed fires and drone intercepts at these sites, without always confirming the specific military logistics function Ukraine attributes to them. Some secondary damage claims from Ukrainian sources remain unverified. And the framing of this as the one depot keeping regional defenses alive is a rhetorical simplification of what is actually a much broader distributed campaign across dozens of facilities nationwide. For sourcing transparency, since a channel like this only stays useful if you can trust where the facts came from, this script drew on Ukraine's general staff statements as reported by Ukrinform, Ukrainska Pravda, and Euromaidan Press on Reuters and Associated Press Wire. Reporting corroborating Governor Vladislav Shapsh's own telegram statements, on satellite imagery analysis from the Ukrainian outlet Militarnyi, on sanctions documentation from Open Sanctions regarding the Typhoon plant, on Defense Express reporting on Typhoon's production capabilities, on the Kyiv Independent's coverage of the broader refinery strike campaign and Russia's export decline, on Kyiv Post's reporting on the wider 2026 strike pattern across Tatarstan, Yaroslavl, Leningrad, and Bashkortostan, and on public statements from SBU Chief Yevhen Kamara and President Volodymyr Zelensky. What remains genuinely unverified includes the precise number of tanks destroyed in the most recent August 2026 strike. Any casualty figures beyond the no casualties reported claims from Russian officials, which the Kyiv Independent has explicitly noted it cannot independently confirm, and the secondary, unconfirmed claims of additional damage circulating around the November 2024 strikes.